All right, let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Rob Shums of Recent Prep. Today we're going to go over SAT and ACT questions, anything you have on those tests, on SAT subject tests, college admissions, really anything you got. Now, the ACT is coming up this Saturday, so I'm going to give priority to ACT questions, since that's perhaps what a lot of you might be wanting to see. But you can send me any questions. You can either post them in the chat, that's fine, or you can see my email address on the screen, ask@reasonprep.com. You can send questions there if you have to send an image or anything like that. So that should be it. Let's see if I had questions prepared. Fix this. Let me get my tablet out here. So yeah, any questions you send, if you're going to send questions on some sort of practice question from a SAT or an ACT or a prep book or something, if you could send the image of the problem, so take a picture of it, email it to ask@reasonprep.com, that would be great. Otherwise, whenever you do send questions, do send the answer, so I don't have to go hunting down the answer to make sure I didn't make a mistake or not. It's good to know if I did it right without having to look up the answer, so that just save some time, save some effort. Good comment. Yeah, tomorrow are the results for the SAT, so that should be interesting. So I don't know the exact time, probably pretty early in the morning, usually, I think around 7 or whatever it is. If someone in chat knows what the exact time they're released, Eastern time at least. But yeah, SAT scores will be released tomorrow. So that'll be interesting to see. I'm sure we'll get a lot of people getting started on their prep for the summer as soon as they get those scores. So that'll be good. Scores for the most recent SAT, the June 3rd SAT, will be, I think they said, July 12th. So, and then the ACT results from this test should be pretty quick, usually about 2 weeks after Saturday's test. So you should know basically where you're at by the end of June for the ACT, and then by the beginning of July for the SAT. If you took the June SAT and you're possibly planning on taking the August SAT or the October SAT, I wouldn't recommend waiting. I wouldn't recommend waiting until you get your July results. Go get started immediately, and then when you get the results in July from the June test, you'll know a little bit more about where you're going and what you need to do. Okay, so we'll start answering some questions here. Again, you can ask them in chat, or you can email ask@reasonprep.com. Whatever works. This light is absolutely killing my eyes. All right, it's better. Okay. There are 10 Khan Academy tests. Should I solve them if I finish the 8 official tests, or should I stick to the official? The 10 tests, I'm actually not super familiar with them. Are they like full tests on Khan Academy? Did they just release those? Let's see. I don't pay that much attention to the Khan Academy stuff. So see the 8 tests that they've released there. I don't see what 10 tests you're referring to from Khan Academy. In any event, I guess the question basically comes down to, though. Oh, they're the same. In any event, yeah. So I'm not sure what tests these are being referred to, but I guess the point is you can just ask generally, should you use Khan Academy after doing the 8 full tests? And yeah, once you've run out of the 8 tests, you got to use what you can use. So Khan Academy would be a fine replacement, particularly for math and for writing. For reading, it's a bit sketchier, but you could do it with reading. Okay, 2 of them are the PSATs. Yeah, so those 10 tests on the Khan Academy website are going to be the 8 official tests plus the 2 PSATs. So yeah, it won't really help you. Thank you, Connor, in chat for that. But Yeah. So, but in terms of the questions on Khan Academy, yeah, you can use those questions if you run out of tests. For reading, it's a bit trickier. I actually have a whole video on this. Let me get the video. If you just go to Google or go to YouTube, and if you search ran out of tests reason prep, you will find my video on this about what to do when you run out of tests for the SAT. For the ACT, it's not that much of an issue. There's so many tests available that if you're doing things right, you probably shouldn't run out of tests, at least in the short term. Maybe over a year you'd run out of tests, or 2 years. But for the ACT, you should be fine in most cases. For the SAT, since there are only 8 SATs and 2 PSATs, it's best to come up with ways to study for that test after you've used those tests. And so if you go to YouTube and you look for this, then that should answer the question of what to do when you run out of tests. So a question about study schedule. Can a good study schedule affect my score significantly? Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I guess really the question is, what does a good study schedule look like? And it's hard for me to come up with something that works for everybody because everybody is doing different tests and they've got different strengths and weaknesses, different goals, different time frames, different backgrounds. So I can't say, here's exactly the things you should do. But my study plan course, if you go to Reason Prep, or in fact, if you just go to the link on this screen where it says rprep.co/courses, you can also just Google Reason Prep SAT ACT study plan. So if you Google this, or just go to reasonprep.com, I've got a whole course that talks about how to set up your study plan. It's a free course, goes through some ideas for setting up a recurring schedule so that you know what you're doing every day, and then the best tips on how to spend your time. So how often to study which subjects, how much time to spend per day, how many days per week, how often you should do practice tests, the kinds of things you should do when you study. All of that's covered in this study plan. So for those of you who haven't enrolled in that already, totally free. Go to Reason Prep. You'll get access to that. If any of you have any specific questions on study plans, I might be able to answer that better. Specific questions or looking for advice, more specific the better. I'll be able to focus the response a bit more effectively. All right, let's just save this. All right. Okay, so we're waiting for people to trickle in. Any questions? I'll take anything on the SAT, the ACT. I will privilege questions for the ACT given that a test is coming up Saturday. But SAT, ACT, SAT subject tests in math, chemistry, literature, physics not as much, and the other ones not as much. I do answer general questions about subject tests. College admissions, anything involving academics, APs, anything like that. I'm pretty wide open, so it's up to you. Like I said, I'll hang out here. I've booked about an hour. I wanted to go from 8:30 to 9:30, so that's the max. If I don't get much questions, then I'll probably end early, but I'll be sticking around at least for a little bit to see as people trickle in. I know it's kind of a weird time, and I don't really announce these very well. I'll wait for questions, and so don't mind the pauses while we wait for some questions to come on in. Okay. Do you offer a specialized study plan with tutoring? Yeah, so if you go to reasonprep.com/ is it tutoring? I forget my own links. Let me see. I believe it's reasonprep.com/tutoring. Let me just check. Yeah. reasonprep.com/tutoring. You can learn more about my tutoring service. The answer is yes, I do. And essentially how it works when we do the full tutoring is each week I set you up with a set of homework assignments to complete for that week. And that includes things like practice sections, videos for my courses to watch. All my tutoring students get access to all my videos for free. Sorry, my mind is half gone today. It's a very busy week. It's the week before the ACT, so I'm tutoring like all day. So my mind is kind of broken right now. But anyway, I'll try my best to be coherent. So Yeah, so you get a study plan for each week, what to do for homework assignments. So practice sections, practice texts, worksheets, packets, flashcard review, videos to watch, other practice questions or other resources to consult. You'll get a listing of what to do for that week, so you know between our sessions what you should work on. And each week I design that for you individually, depending on your goals, your needs, where you're at. So yeah, that is definitely part of it. We don't just do practice tests. So I do a practice test probably about every 3 weeks, maybe even every 4 weeks, because full practice tests are not really how you learn. Full practice tests tell you where you're at in your scoring range, but they don't tell you, they don't really help you learn as much. We learn more through practice sections, timed sections, worksheets, packets, videos, targeted instruction like that. Is it possible to mix the studying of SAT 1 and SAT 2 if I previously studied for SAT 1 a lot and I just still need some improvement? SAT 1 in October and 2 in November. Sure. So if you've done a lot of studying for the SAT 1, you're more going to be in more of a maintenance mode slash kind of slow and steady increases and improvements, right? If you've already plucked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, you've already gotten some score increases, you've already kind of gotten the easy score increases, and now it's just going to take more time and repetition, and as well to maintain what you've learned. So absolutely, you're going to kind of go on more of a maintenance schedule for SAT 1, whatever that might look like for you, and then more intensive studying with the SAT 2. When I discourage people from studying both at the same time, that's usually in the context of someone who hasn't started studying for either the SAT 1 or any of the subject tests and kind of starting fresh with both. That's hard to do. But if you've put in a lot of time studying for the SAT 1, then you're kind of in maintenance mode slash, gradual improvement mode, and that's fine. You can then mix it with subject tests. Okay, highest math score is a 780. Awesome, very good, congrats. I've been doing some pretty hardcore any tips to get my score to an 800? I've been doing some pretty hardcore content review for the last couple of weeks. So you're doing exactly what you have to do. You're at the point where the difference between a 780 and 800 is 2 questions. And so luck, silly mistakes, not knowing a certain piece of content or forgetting it that day, too much variance comes in. You're always going to be bouncing around within a certain tight range. The goal is to get that range a little bit higher. So what you're doing sounds exactly right. Focus, especially in your situation, on the hard questions. And let me actually get the list. The hard questions in the math sections is exactly where you want to focus your effort. So let me get that list. So here is a list of the hard questions that you want to focus on when you're studying. So in section 3, it's 12 to 15 and 18 to 20. Section 4, 24 to 30, 35 to 38. So those are the ones you want to drill. Make sure you know those really well and all the concepts that go along with it. In addition to that, it's going to be avoiding silly mistakes. And I have a lot of videos in previous live streams I've talked about how to avoid silly mistakes. In fact, if you go to my channel, you look up my recent videos, I made a video, an excerpt video about how to avoid silly mistakes. But it sounds like you're doing exactly what you want to do. You want to keep just hitting the concepts, because you're kind of think of here's a good analogy. This actually makes a lot of sense, I think. Imagine you have your time axis here and your score axis here for SAT math, and let's say this is the score of an 800. You can kind of think your score improvement, we can generally just imagine to model it kind of like a log, or not a log function, but like a function that approaches the 800 score asymptotically, such that your first initial improvements are going to be pretty quick, right? You can see that the slope of this is pretty steep over this time period. But as you get closer and closer and closer to 800, you're going to get less improvement on average for the time you invest because you're dealing with smaller and smaller ranges. So that's the way to think about it. You're in this region, so it's really just pushing, 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 doing exactly what you're doing. It sounds like you're doing what you want to do. There aren't any specific question types that you miss. Yeah, that makes it a little bit harder because it's more random. It's like one day you miss the trig question, another day you miss a function question, another day you miss a percent question. That makes it harder if there's no obvious weaknesses. Again, that's why it's just continuing to push on those hard things and not ignoring what you're already good at. So make sure you can get better and faster at the stuff you already get right to leave you more time and energy to deal with the harder stuff. We'd have to see some specific questions that you're getting wrong and try to figure out why you're getting them wrong to give more specific advice, but at least that's where I would start trying to think about it at least. In what way can I benefit from the previous record I made in the log Google Sheets of the questions that I did wrong in the previous official test? So I believe this is referring to, in my study plan course, there's like a Google Sheet that comes with it that you can use to keep track of your progress and the questions you got wrong. And this question is basically asking, what do I do with the previous questions that I've gotten wrong in the months or weeks before? This is a really great question because this is an overlooked part of studying that I think the more I think about it is more and more important. And so what you want to do is redo these questions. Redo these questions, the ones you got wrong. If you redo these questions and you still get them wrong, then you know you don't know the material yet. If you do them again and you get them right, well, that's at least moving in the direction that you know exactly how to tackle those questions. So redo them. You don't have to do them timed. One of the things I'm thinking about developing down the line, and I'm curious what people would eventually think about it, is like putting these cards on flashcards, or instead of putting them on paper, putting them in a kind of a card format so that you could kind of set aside the questions you've gotten wrong and in the future redo them in a kind of organized way. I think that would be really useful. It's something I'm thinking about doing. It's just a complicated project potentially. So, but definitely redo them. Don't ignore them. And then if you get them wrong again, set them aside again. Do them again later. Again, you don't have to do them timed, but certainly redoing those questions can absolutely be very useful to confirm or not whether you know the material. The ACT Science is so hard, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, it is hard. The timing is really rough. The passages seem pretty intimidating very often. It's super different from a lot of what you've done in your classes, even in your science classes. So yeah, it definitely seems hard. But I think the focus there should be on that it seems hard. I think the test is more intimidating than it actually is when you see how the questions are solved, how you approach them. So I would say your feeling is totally valid, but what you eventually want to see is actually it's not maybe as bad as it may seem on the surface, that it's a lot of bark, not much bite. Now, certainly there are parts of it that are hard. I'm not saying it's not, but I think it seems harder than it is. In terms of what you're supposed to do, it's very broad. I can't go through everything to do for ACT Science. That would be, 5 live streams. But where I would say is go to my YouTube channel. Go to my YouTube channel. Just Google Reason Prep. And I have a playlist, ACT Science playlist. So I have some videos there from various topics related to ACT Science. I've got some preview videos for my ACT Science Bootcamp, which is my complete course on my site. But I've got a lot of other videos in the ACT Science playlist, which covers various topics. I would start there. And make sure you use those and do a lot of practice sections. Do them timed. Always do them timed. Beyond that, if you have any more specific questions, I'd be happy to address that further. Thank you so much for your advice. You are very welcome. Are there any tips you can give in improving on the grammar and English section on the ACT? Would studying more for these sections also help me on the science? Answer the second question first. No, they're pretty different sections, so studying for English won't really help with science. They're different in terms of content and in terms of the fact that the English is much more leisurely in its time than the science is. Best way to improve for ACT English is simply it just comes down to learning the grammar rules. It's a very repetitive section. They test the same things again and again. Subject-verb agreement, tense, pronoun agreement, comma usage, semicolons, colons, fragments, comma splices, run-on sentences, right? It's the same stuff again and again and again. And if you don't know those rules or you're a little weak on them, that's going to be a problem. Same thing with other question types like rhetorical skills, questions involving adding sentences, deleting sentences, rearranging sentences, adding information, all that kind of stuff. They come up again and again and again, and there are certain principles you can use to attack them. So really what it comes down to is learning those rules. And I have a free ACT English Bootcamp course that covers this completely, everything you need. So I would start there. If you're taking your test this Saturday, you probably can't get through the entire thing. I would just pick and choose, go through the videos that seem most interesting to you. Part of the problem with that is they're somewhat cumulative. They do build on each other, so that might be a little bit weird, but you can at least now just kind of dip in and out and see if you can learn some of the rules and approaches to questions there. I also go through 5 complete tests, question by question. So I recommend doing one of those practice tests and then watching my video on how to do the solutions. That might help as well. So go to either YouTube or reasonprep.com. Look for this. There's also a link on the screen. It's rprep.co/courses. That should help you with that. I just took the SAT, and I'm so thankful I found you. Well, welcome. Glad to have you. Hope the SAT went well on Saturday. I assume that's when you took it last. I recently took an ACT reading test today, and I found myself spending approximately 10 minutes on each passage. How can I quickly and accurately achieve these questions to achieve a possible 36? So very broad, a lot of things we could say about this. I would say you kind of have, I don't know what your score is right now, but this is obviously the major concern. Like in order to get a 36, we'll need to have a good shot at each question. And this would be 40 minutes overall. You only have 35 minutes, so you'd be quite short, not even counting the ones you might get wrong. So I would say right now the first thing you need to do is get used to that time. So I don't know if you're doing them timed from like 35 minutes and then checking your answers, or if you're doing them untimed. If you're doing them untimed, I would definitely switch to doing them timed immediately. You have to get used to the pace and the pressure. So that's one thing. The second thing is I would worry about getting more questions right than necessarily finishing the test or getting them all right at this point. Again, I don't know what your score is right now, but maybe I'll just hazard a guess that you're in the 20s. Maybe that's a good guess. Your goal, if you're, let's say, in the mid-20s, is to get to the high 20s, not to go from the mid-20s to a 36 in one jump. Certainly, in the long run, you can go make that as your goal. But if you're at like a 25 now, trying to go from a 25 to a 36 at once is going to be basically impossible. You got to go from a 25 to a 28, and then from a 28 to a 30, and then a 30 to a 32, right? Build yourself up, because the skills at each level are quite different, and what you have to focus on at each level is quite different. I would say go to, I hate keeping having to do this, but it's hard to address really broad questions with anything useful. So go to my YouTube channel, just Google Reason Prep ACT Reading Playlist. I got a bunch of videos there on the ACT Reading section, so check that out. If you have any other specific questions, I'd be happy to follow up on that. Whoa. I need more help on the ACT science section as well. I seem to drain a lot of time and can't interpret the graphs correctly. How do we approach these questions? So if you want to send or pick a specific question that we can look at from a real ACT, I'd be happy to do that. I can give more specific, focused advice. Generally, in terms of graph questions, the main thing I would say is you should know the type of question that you're dealing with. And you have questions just like fact find, where basically you just have to find the piece of data in the table or the graph. It's pretty straightforward. You've got questions involving what's called extrapolation and interpolation, where you're basically extending the trend of a curve, or you're looking within a curve to see what points would correspond to that curve itself, whether you've extended it or you're looking at points within it. You've got questions based on comparing, we just say like cross-referencing figures, where you have to take data from one and use it to help you answer a question based on another figure. So it's kind of knowing what's in the universe, but also kind of knowing that, as I was saying before with the ACT science section, these questions are actually often some of the easier ones. So a lot of times what students run into with these is way overthinking it and way concerning themselves too much with the science and like what it means, rather than kind of being used to, okay, what are the kinds of things they ask me, such as these, and what's the easiest, most simple way to answer them. So if you want to give a specific example from a test, you can just name the test date and question, and I'll find it, and we can take a look at a specific question, and I'd be happy to do that. Should I study vocab in the short term for SAT reading? So a lot of caveats here. Generally, I'd say no. It's probably not a good use of your time, depending on your score, depending on what exactly you mean by short term. For most students, the answer would be no, though, just because there's probably other leaks in your approach or strategy that are making more of a difference. If you have the time and the inclination, then studying vocabulary might be useful. I have a vocabulary list on my website. Just go to reasonprep.com, look for a vocab list. But for most students, the answer to this would probably be no. Because there's just too many other things you could focus on that are more profitable than studying a list of words that frankly are somewhat speculative. And yeah, so I would probably say no in most cases. Okay, so questions about his or her on the SAT. I don't think I've seen this too much on the ACT, but if it applied, it would technically still be applicable there. So let me give an example of this to see what this might look like. And there'll be another one of these cases where I'll give you guys a second to think about the question, and then I'll talk about it. So let me think of a sentence here. So the question is, here's a sentence: each student should bring their books to class. Is this correct? Is there appropriate here? Or should we use his or her? So I will give you all a minute to think about that. Should this be there, or should it be his or her? Those are our two choices. So should it be there or his or her? Which one do you think should go in this case? If you want, you can post your answer in chat. You don't have to. You can just silently think along. But I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and then we'll talk about what the answer is and why. Okay, so this is going to be indeed his or her. Why? Well, the first thing to see, and this is one of the tricky parts, is this noun, each student, or the student being the noun and each being the adjective, but basically the noun phrase, each student, is the antecedent. It's what this pronoun is referring to. And when you have each student, this is actually singular. Same would be true if it was every student. Every student, each student is actually singular, weirdly enough. You'd think it might be plural, but it's actually singular. So a plural pronoun there is actually inappropriate, because this is an example of what's called pronoun agreement. Your pronouns have to agree with their nouns in number. So if the noun is singular, as it is in this case, you need a singular pronoun. Now, you could go with each student should bring his books to class, or each student should bring her books to class if you were referring to a single gendered group. It used to be in the 50s, for example, that we would just say his. His was the default pronoun in these cases. But we don't do that because that's sexist. We don't want to assume it's just men. So English doesn't have a really good solution for this. What we have to do then is use his or her, which is essentially the gender neutral singular pronoun. And so that would be appropriate here because it's singular, his or her, and it has both genders, so you don't have that issue of just his or just her. Now here's the thing. This is what it is on the SAT. His or her would be correct. In real life, we would probably never say his or her. This is where the trick comes in. We probably would say, or even read or write in real life, each student should bring their books to class, and no one would care, or at least people that we would want to be friends with wouldn't care, because it sounds fine. We understand what it's saying. There's no meaning lost. His or her is just really awkward. Each student should bring his or her books to class. It's just ugly. So we would use there in real life, but that's what they're doing. They want you to use your experience from kind of informal language in real life to go with something like there, but his or her is appropriate in this case. So to sum up, you use his or her when you need it to be singular, but you don't want to say just his or just her because it's a mix of people, even though it's singular. It's kind of a very weird edge niche case, but sometimes it comes up. If I know all the rules for the SAT writing section and watched all the course, what can I do other than solving practice tests to improve rhetorical skills? So these are the questions where you have to rearrange a sentence, delete a sentence, add a sentence. These really come down to reading skills. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So if your reading is something that's weaker for you, the reading section, that you might also find the rhetorical skills questions in the writing section are also pretty tricky because it takes the same kinds of skills. It's reading comprehension. It's determining, okay, what's the main idea of this passage or paragraph? How does the argument develop in the paragraph? What sentences or opening words or changes to the sentences might be appropriate to enhance the logic of the argument? So it's really reading. So a lot of what you would do for reading will also help you with these questions. Beyond learning the 4 principles, which are in the course, doing practice questions, and really trying to understand the answers to the ones, especially the ones you get wrong. Besides that, and just doing what you would do for reading, there's not much more specific because it really comes down to reading and understanding the passage as a whole. I would say one tip for these in general, and I talk about this in the course and elsewhere, is don't get tunnel vision. By tunnel vision, I mean way too often students just focus on the underlined thing and kind of ignore the sentence or even the paragraph. They just kind of focus way too much on the underlined thing. You got to always keep your mind open to the sentence that's the underlined portion is in, at the very least, and very often the paragraph or even the sentence is just around that sentence. The more you get tunnel vision on these rhetorical skills questions, the more you'll lose track of. It basically becomes impossible to know what's appropriate as a choice. Same thing would be, again, this comes back to the strategies I talk about, the principles. Reread the question. Too often we focus so much on the passage and the choices and the underlined portion that we forget that there's often a question that needs to be answered directly. So those are 2 things I would say. Beyond that, yeah, it's really just like reading. So a lot of the challenges with reading come up here as well. Okay, so I have difficulties in the SAT reading. I often read the entire passage, then answer the questions. For this reason, I can only get through 4 passages. How can I improve? So my reading strategy is to not read the passage first, to go right to the question. So perhaps what's happening is you're spending way too much time reading the passage before you go to the questions, way too much time worried about stuff and trying to figure out stuff that they don't actually ask questions about later. We only really care about stuff in the passage that they ask questions about. So anytime we spend reading and worrying and thinking about stuff that doesn't end up being asked is a waste of time. So I talk about this a lot in various of my videos, so check out my YouTube channel. But generally, I recommend go write to the questions, use the questions, starting with the specific ones. Do those, and as you do those, you're going to read through the passage. Because if you think about it, if you read through the passage once and then you go to the questions, you have to reread the passage again to answer those questions. So you're reading it twice. Cut out the first one, focus on specific questions first, and then work your way through the passage as you answer those questions. And then at the end, after you've read the whole thing and answered all the specific questions, then you go back to the main idea questions and the general questions. So I would say that will help you with your time management. Give that a shot. Give that some practice. I have double time for the ACT. What would you do to study? So it depends on your score. I would say the main thing I would say, given that you've taken the time issue out of the equation, is for reading and science really double down on. You probably have to use a different strategy, where I probably would recommend in your case to actually give the passages a read through on the ACT before you go to the questions. Normally for science and partially for reading, I recommend going right to the questions. But for you, since you've got double time, I would definitely give the passages a read through. Otherwise, it's hard to say exactly. I don't think you would necessarily do anything different with double time. It changes maybe your strategies for approaching certain sections. But the one thing I would say, this is going to be kind of painful probably for you, but you're going to have to do it, I think, if you want to kind of maximize what you're doing. Do practice tests timed with double time. And the reason why, you may not think this is something you would need to do because you have double time and time is not an issue, but it actually ends up kind of being a double issue for you, literally, in the sense that, normally the reading section is 45 minutes, or the English is 45 minutes. Well, now it's 90 minutes. The math is usually an hour. Well, now it's 2 hours. That's an insane amount of time to do that work. Your test is going to be like 6-7 hours long, and you need to build up the stamina, right? Sure, you're not going to have to rush potentially, but you're going to have to potentially sit there for a long time, especially if you finish early. Although I don't know, sometimes, I guess it depends on the situation. But long story short, you're going to want to practice it with full time because you're going to want to build up that stamina to be able to sit there for 6 hours, 7 hours. And like I said, it might be pretty painful, but you kind of want to get used to that because the last thing you want to have happen is just crash and burn in the middle of the test because it's just so long. So getting double time is kind of double-edged sword. You do sidestep a lot of the problems with the timing of the tests, especially in reading and science, but then you've got a lot of time to work, and that could be pretty mentally draining as well. How to know what is wrong if I study for a long time, but there's only little improvement in terms of the questions I get right, so should I change my way of studying? So it's hard to know without knowing exactly what you're doing with studying. For most people, though, here's the thing. If your way of studying is just doing a practice test and then checking your answers and then not really reviewing it and then doing another practice test and checking your answers and looking at your score and then doing another practice test and then doing another practice test and another practice test, if you're doing that, then yeah, you got to change your way of studying because that's not really efficient. If you're doing the studying in the way that I've laid out or others have laid out in terms of using your time effectively, watching videos, doing reading, whatever it is you're doing to practice, then in most cases, the issue is not with your study program. It's not like, if only you had studied this way, you'd get an improvement. So I wouldn't worry about that. Sometimes these things just take time, especially, again, it depends on the section you're talking about. Reading, for example, can take time because it is very skill-based. So sometimes all you can really do is just keep at it. And then finally, if you're studying on your own, it really is important to get an outside perspective because if you're only studying on your own, self-prepping, you may not even know the mistakes you're making. You may be completely blind to your errors, even if you think you know them. Or you might be missing places for efficiency. So whether that's a tutor or joining a class, or really, in most cases, if that's not an option for you, working with a friend, study buddy, joining my study group on Facebook, working with a teacher at school or something, an older sibling or a parent, whatever it might be, you need that outside perspective. It doesn't have to be an SAT tutor if you've got other resources. But getting that outside perspective to say, hey, look, you're missing this mistake, you're totally missing this, or you're making this error and you don't realize it. That's really important too, because sometimes self-prep can only go so far. We're often blind to our own issues. So getting that outside perspective is probably the most important thing you should do at this point. Is there any new ideas or new projects coming soon for the website? Yeah, so right now it's super busy because I'm the ACT is Saturday, so my week is totally crushed. But once the summer starts, I'll be getting into a more regular tutoring schedule, and I do have a new thing planned. It'll be the SAT crash course, which will be basically a condensed version of everything, so that if you only had a few hours to study, or if you want the core lessons of how to do well on the SAT, you would get it from the crash course. That's my next project, and after that will be similarly an ACT crash course. So again, it's meant for people who only have a short amount of time to study, or just are so busy you can't do a full program, or you just want a summary, or you want the core lessons, the core principles of how to approach these tests. That's what these courses will be like. So I'm hopefully going to start them in earnest next week, and I'm hoping to get them out sooner rather than later. My goal is to have them out before the school year starts, so before September. That would be the goal. So cross your fingers. Are there sites that we can read some passages to acquire new words for the SAT? So probably, but I think the best thing really is just to read regular stuff. There's nothing really specific, like SAT training passages, I don't think. It probably would be pretty boring stuff. So if you go to my website, if you look up Reason Prep SAT ACT reading list, I have a whole reading list that goes through things like what websites you can read, what magazines, newspapers, blogs, novels, things like that, what you can read to continue building your skills. And so that should address the kinds of things you should read. How many times do you recommend to take the SAT? Totally depends on your situation. Generally speaking, a good amount is in the 2 to 3 region. If you can get your score in one test, that's great. No worries. 2 to 3 is usually, I would say, the average. And if you go higher than that, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the case. But if you go like 4 or 5 times, it's not. The colleges are not going to like immediately disqualify you. It's not going to be that kind of an issue. It's more of just like having to do the test 4 to 5 times sounds painful. But 2 to 3 is generally, I think, a good target amount. One test for your first attempt at it. Second test will be after some extensive prep, and then hopefully you're done. If not, you do a bit more retooling, retraining, and then go from for the third. And then by then, you should be pretty close to where you want to go, typically. How to finish the ACT science test. I took a practice test and skipped the whole passage and got a 24. Should I skip the guess on the ones I don't know, instantly move on, so I can attempt all the passages? So I talk about this a lot in a lot of videos, my ACT science course. Don't get hung up on finishing the test. If you're getting a 24, it's not because you can't finish a test. Finishing a test is if you're going for, if your target right now is a 34 or a 35. Then finishing the test is important. But you can get a 30 without finishing the test. Right? Nothing is stopping you from getting a 30 if you don't complete every question. What's stopping you is getting questions wrong, right? So finishing the test right now is not the goal. What the goal is getting more questions right. So getting to your question, you're moving in the right direction. Skipping the ones you don't know, or more appropriately, skipping the ones that seem hard and time-consuming and focusing on easier questions to bank those easy questions, to build a foundation, that's absolutely something you should do. I talk about this a lot in various videos and courses, but the key is to pick the easy questions, which are generally the graph and figure questions to start. You want to really make sure you get most, if not all of those correct, because those are generally easier than the rest, and you need to bank those. The harder questions are going to be the ones on experimental design, reasoning, sometimes outside knowledge. I wouldn't really include that there. But basically, the experimental design, reasoning, conclusions type questions are the harder, generally more time-consuming questions. Now, not that you can't do them, but the priority, you need to bank these points. So in that passage you skipped, you perhaps, depending on the passage, skipped a lot of easy questions. It's possible, in favor of maybe working on harder questions elsewhere. So the actual approach and strategy is a bit more complicated, but generally, yeah, focus on easy questions. I recommend doing the passages in a certain order. And it's going to be this order. So you generally want to do the 6 question passages first because they're typically easier than the rest. Then the 7 question research summary passages. These are the ones with experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, things like that. And then the 7 question conflicting viewpoints passage absolutely last. That is the one that's basically all text that compares different scientists or students. That's the one you want to do last. And then within the passages, you want to focus on the easier questions first. Just as a side thing, I can say pretty unequivocally, I guess that's somewhat of a contradiction. So I can say unequivocally that if, we'll do this in red, if you are doing the questions in order from numbers 1 to 40, you are likely doing something wrong. So this might be interesting to some of you who don't know this. If you're doing the questions in the science section and also the reading section as well in the ACT, if you're doing them in order from 1 to 40, you're probably doing something wrong. Doing them in order from 1 to 40 is almost always inefficient and just not optimal. So doing the passages in this order and jumping around within the passages to focus on the easier questions is where you start. As a side note, this document that I'm writing on will be available after the session. You just got to go to my website. I'm going to put it up probably tomorrow. If you go to my website, go to the live stream section. I put up all the notes from the session so you can get access to everything I've written here there. Can you put a list of sites that are good for ACT practice tests? There's really only one you need. crackact.com, I think it is. Yep. This one contains basically all the released by the ACT company, all the previously administered ACTs that they've released. So that's all you need. That's going to give you like 30-something ACTs. That should be more than enough for what you're doing. Is it worth it to get an outside perspective or help in making my study schedule, or should I make it on my own? What are the advantages and disadvantages? So yeah, definitely worth getting an outside perspective. Absolutely. There are no disadvantages to that. Outside of maybe if you have to get a tutor paying for it. But yeah, I think it's a great idea. You can definitely do it on your own. I think, though, given the questions you've asked previously, I don't think the study schedule is your issue at all. I think there's a lot of fixation on, like, am I doing this right? Am I doing that right? And certainly there might be some things to clean up, but I think you just need the outside perspective, not so much on, like, building a study plan necessarily, but, like, getting into the nitty-gritty of the questions. Like, what mistakes are you making? What mistakes do you not know you're making? That's the most important thing, I would say. So, yeah, if you can get outside help with it, great. But I don't think a study plan is the issue in most cases, especially if you follow, like, my study plan in my study plan course, available for free to those of you who don't have it. I just don't see that being an issue. Process isn't really the issue in most cases. As long as you're working a little bit every day, you're working consistently, you're mixing up what you're studying, you're working with real tests, you're using a prep book or prep videos, whatever you're doing, you're working with a tutor, whatever course. As long as you're doing that, you're fine. It's not, your issue is not that. Your issue is something with actually tackling the questions, with your strategy, something you're missing. That's more likely the problem. What time is it? Okay, so by the way, 10-minute warning. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if you want to ask any final questions, do so. I'll be ending at 9:30 Eastern Time, which is 10 minutes, whenever that is for you, wherever you are. I'll be ending in 10 minutes. How should you study off of Crack ACT? Just take as many practice ACT as possible. Well, yes and no. So I talk about this elsewhere, and I mentioned this earlier. Generally, I recommend taking a full timed practice test every 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how much time you have until the real thing. So this is where I differ from a lot of tutors, courses, companies, advice. I think the main, we were talking about before with that other student about the study schedule, and I don't think, the reason why I didn't bring this up there is I don't think that this is what that student was doing. This is where I have an exception though with what I was saying. If you are just doing practice test after practice test after practice test after practice test, especially if you're not reviewing your work after, reviewing every question, even the ones you got right. If you're not doing targeted review on certain topics or strategies or whatever, if you're just doing practice test after practice test, I guarantee you that's not good enough. You need to mix it up with a lot of other stuff. You only should be taking a full test every 3 to 4 weeks. So the question then comes, well, what should you do in the meantime? Well, that's exactly what I talk about in the study plan course. Practice tests, there's two uses for practice tests. I mean, you can use practice tests for sections, but I'm talking about like doing them all in a row, sitting down, doing the English, math, reading, science, or in the SAT, reading, writing, math, sitting down and doing it all in a row. There's only 2 real uses for that. 1, get a score, know where you're at, more or less. And 2, build stamina. That's it. You don't improve by taking a practice test. That's not how you improve. Reviewing the practice test, yeah, that's certainly helpful, but just taking it doesn't help. It's like, imagine an athletic analogy. If you're a runner, if you do long distance, if you do sprinting, let's say you're a sprinter, do you get better by doing sprinting competitions? Not really. The sprinting competition is like a measure of where you're at. You get better from targeted, focused practice day after day. Sure, you do a lot of sprinting, but it's in a structured, ordered way. It's not just kind of like random, just sprinting. There's going to be a program put in place to help you build your strength to get better so that when competition day comes, in our analogy, the full test day comes, you're ready for that. So it's not just about practice tests. They're certainly important, but they're definitely not everything. Don't overdo practice tests. So do individual sections as practice? Yeah, that's one of the things you can definitely do. Do individual sections as part of the practice regimen. You always want to do them timed. Always do tests and sections timed. That's super important because, especially for the ACT, because time is such an important element. Always do them timed for sure. In the case of studying, self-studying, is there a limit where I can't improve anymore, or only a little improvement where I should start asking for others' help, or that I will improve by time? So totally depends on the situation. But I would say if you're noticing that you've hit a plateau, so you keep preparing, keep studying, you're doing the right things, but your score's not really budging, that's probably a sign that it might be useful to get some outside perspective, basically. Is there a limit to where you can improve? No. I think there are people who've gotten perfect scores by self-studying. Obviously, that's rare, but it's possible. There's no limit in principle to how high you can go with self-studying. But I think in reality, most people are going to hit a plateau where, if you're making a mistake, by definition, you don't know how to do something. How then are you supposed to know what you're supposed to do, like what mistake you're making if you can't do it, right? There's a disconnect there. And sometimes with enough work, you can overcome that and enough guidance with books or videos or courses, whatever you're doing. But for many people, you need to have at least a little bit of input from somebody to point you maybe in the right direction with what you're doing. I realize this is really high. It doesn't matter. Okay, let's take a few more questions and then we're going to wrap up for today. How to review ACT science practice tests. So this applies to really any practice section you do for the SAT or the ACT, but let's use the ACT science as an example. So first thing you do, get a real test. Real tests only. So you should be able to avoid third-party tests like Barron's, Princeton Review. If you have real tests like you can get from Crack ACT, there's no reason to use any of that stuff, especially or in particular for timed sections. So get a real test, complete the test, timed, use a bubble sheet if possible, because you want to simulate the test experience as much as possible, but definitely complete the test timed. Check your answers and score it. Then review every question, especially at first when you're first starting out. Eventually, when you're getting stronger and you understand a lot more of the questions, you can focus more on the ones you got wrong or the ones that gave you a little bit of trouble. But at first, you want to review every question. And if you got it right, did you get it right for a good reason? Right? So you can get a question right, but maybe you guessed. Maybe you got lucky. So you want to review that. If you got it right, can you do it better? So just because you got a question right doesn't mean there might not be a better way to complete the question next time. So you want to maybe get faster somehow. So you might ask that. If you got a question wrong, why? So did you not know a concept? Did you make an error? Did you misread something? Were you completely confused? Did you not know what the question said? You need to find this out. Find out what mistakes you made and record them. So have some sort of way to keep track of the mistakes you've made. A notebook, a Google Doc, a spreadsheet, whatever you use, whatever you like. But keep track of your mistakes. What are you doing? Try to find trends. And then rinse and repeat. Record your errors and come back to those questions later. So down the line, weeks or months later, you can come back to them and see after some studying if you get them right again. And that can also help to confirm whether you've gotten it. But yeah, that's the core of how you do a science test. It is a long process. You're going to spend, especially at first, more time reviewing the questions than you will doing the test. That's totally normal and totally okay and fine. So that's basically how the process works. And it helps to have a tutor guide you through that. But you can definitely self-study it as well. Okay, a couple more questions and then we're going to wrap up. If I'm prepping for the September ACT, how should I go about watching these prep videos? I assume you mean mine. If you have access to all of the SAT and or all the ACT videos on my website, you can go to rprep.co/courses to learn more. How would you go about watching these? So basically how I set it up in the study plan, I would set a day a week to focus on each section. So like Monday might be English, Tuesday might be math, Wednesday might be reading, Thursday might be science, and then for the other 2 days that you would study, you could pick the two sections that give you the most trouble or rotate it in. So let's say you have the most trouble in math and science, so you might say Friday would be math, Saturday would be science, and Sunday would be like something like a rest. So on each of these days, on each of these days, you can watch 1 to 2. Depends on how much time you have. I guess you do September ACT. So probably 30 to 45 minutes of video. And complete a practice section. I go into more detail about this in the ACT, in the SAT ACT study plan course available free on my site. But yeah, this would be the general outline. So you'd break up each day for a different subject. You'd watch the videos on my site. You just watch them in order. There's nothing fancy about it. You just watch them as they're presented. I designed the videos to lay out exactly what you should do. And yeah, you just split it up like that. And then by the time you get to June, by the time you get to mid-July, you should probably be close to finish with, you'll definitely be finished with the lecture videos. And then you can start working through the solution videos to the practice tests. And yeah, you should be able to make it through all the videos by July, I would say, if you're working consistently. And you could adjust this. If you need to do more English, or you need to do more reading, or you don't really need to do reading as much, change it up. But that would be a good starting point. All right, a couple more questions, and then we're going to finish because we are above 9:30. So, how can you review the questions on Crack ACT if it just gives you the answers? Well, that's the rub. That's where either a tutor would help, or if you're doing it on your own, it comes down to that's learning, basically. You need to look at the question and start thinking, what mistakes did I make? What do I not know? What do I not understand in this question? That's the effort. If you do that, that's where you're going to really rock it and improve. There's no shortcut. Yeah, even with a tutor or a class, you're going to have to do this process of kind of figuring out what mistakes you're making and how to improve on them. So yeah, it's not something that it's a skill that you learn, right? This whole process of reviewing and learning for these tests is the process of learning. It's what you would do in your classes in general, right? And so it's really valuable actually to build that skill, because when you do get to college, like if you think you're not getting much support from teachers now, you should wait until college, depending on where you go. But in most cases, professors are going to let you sink or swim. Like, they'll help you if you come to them for help, but they're not going to hold your hand. So if you learn now when you're in high school how to study, how to prepare, how to ask questions when you do need help from teachers or tutors or TAs in college, whatever, that will pay off so much more. Because the big thing a lot of students run into when they get to college is they don't know this is going to happen. They think it's like high school, and the professors are not going to chase you down to say, oh, you almost failed the last test, come in for office hours. They're not really going to do that in many cases. They're going to just be like, you're an adult now, deal with it. You can obviously go and ask them help. You can go to them directly, but they're not going to chase you down. And a lot of students like that because no one's breathing down their neck, but then they get their Fs and their first semester, and then reality hits. So yeah, this is the process of learning. It's going to take time, and yeah, it will be worth it though, for sure. Is quality better than quantity if I stay a long time reviewing a test? Yep, that is ultimately a good way to summarize it. Quality is better than quantity. Doing practice test with no review is not great. Doing a practice test with careful review, focusing on concepts, working through books or courses, whatever, all that stuff is exactly what you want to do. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up. So I will probably not have another live stream before the ACT on Saturday because I'm really, really busy with students. But I will be having more live streams in the summer. I announced them on my YouTube channel. I announced them in my Facebook group. If you're part of my mailing list, I send emails out about them when they come out. You probably also get emails from YouTube when these things go on. If you're a subscriber to me on YouTube, so subscribe to me on YouTube if you want more. I'll be posting the highlight video to this, tomorrow. The whole recording of this will probably come out right after we stop. And the thing I wrote on here, the notes will be available as well on my website tomorrow. So go ahead and check that out when the highlights video is up. But yeah, good luck if you're taking the test on Saturday. And I look forward to talking with you all and doing more questions probably sometime next week. All right, thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.